like peas in a pod. Or birds of a feather, alone or together you'll find that we are two.
He was Hollywood's gentlest legend until he cut one person out forever. Not a rival, not a producer, someone closer and far more dangerous. From a father's shadow to a career built on charm, Dick Van Dyke finally exposed the hidden truth. The line he drew, the vow he kept, and the moment he refused to speak to him again. Stay, because the reveal changes everything you think you know. Everyone knew Dick Van Dyke as the man who could make you laugh just by tripping over a footstool. His smile was disarming, his charm effortless, and his reputation spotless. But behind that warm exterior, something else was brewing. Something even he couldn't hide forever. Years later, when he finally opened up about it, fans were stunned. The world's kindest clown admitted that he had been living with a shadow. Not another person, not an enemy in Hollywood, but a version of himself that was slowly pulling him under. It started with a confession, one he made not to the press, not to his audience, but in the safety of therapy. Dick revealed that the man America adored on screen was locked in battle with another man entirely. This other self was darker, more dangerous, and much harder to silence. For decades, he had been fighting against a weakness that threatened to consume his career, his relationships, and even his life. What made the revelation even more shocking was that Dick admitted he wasn't just battling addiction, he was repeating history. His father, Lauren, nicknamed Cookie, had walked the very same path. Cookie was a traveling salesman, often gone for long stretches, and when he was home, he wasn't always present. Alcohol was his crutch, and young Dick saw what it did to his family. He saw the distance it created, the weight it placed on his mother, and the confusion it left in the children. Years later, when Dick was in therapy, he recognized something terrifying. He had become his father. The smile, the slapstick, the success. None of it mattered when he looked in the mirror and saw the same destructive patterns staring back. That realization cut deeper than any tabloid headline or Hollywood rumor. For Dick, who had built a reputation as a beacon of kindness and optimism, it was a betrayal of his own values. He had always promised himself he would never become the kind of man his father had been in those darker years. Yet here he was, decades into his career, quietly admitting that he was living a double life. Fans never suspected a thing. On television, he was the eternal optimist, a man whose very name was synonymous with joy. But in private, Dick had reached the point where he could no longer pretend. He told his therapist, and later admitted publicly, that he had to draw a line. To save himself, he had to refuse to speak to that other man ever again. The version of himself who reached for the bottle, who distanced himself from loved ones, who threatened to undo everything he had built. That vow would change the course of his life. It was the day the smile slipped just long enough to show the cracks beneath it. For an entertainer who seemed incapable of anger or cruelty, it was unthinkable. But what came next proved that Dick's decision to silence that shadow wasn't just about survival. It would ripple into his career, his family, and the legacy he left behind. Because soon, those hidden battles began to bleed into the very spotlight that made him famous. Before there was Hollywood, before the bright lights and perfect comedic timing, there was a little boy growing up in Danville, Illinois. That boy was Dick Van Dyke, and at the center of his childhood stood a complicated figure. His father, Lauren, known to everyone as Cookie. Cookie wasn't the kind of dad you saw every night at the dinner table. He was a traveling salesman, gone for days or weeks at a time, and when he was home, the warmth wasn't always there. His job took him away, but it was something else that built the wall between him and his children: alcohol. Cookie's drinking carved the first fracture line in the Van Dyke family. Dick remembered his father as charming and funny at times, but also distant, unpredictable, and prone to withdrawing into himself when the bottle took over. To a young child, it was confusing. The man who was supposed to be the foundation of the household often felt like a ghost, present but unreachable. Dick's mother, Hazel, worked hard to fill the gaps, but the strain was obvious. The household became a place where love and laughter were mixed with silence and disappointment. What makes this so chilling is that Dick carried the memory of those years with him long after fame arrived. He would later admit that his father eventually quit drinking, a triumph for Cookie. But by then, the imprint had already been made. Dick had seen how alcohol could swallow a man whole, how it could put cracks in a family that never fully healed. And the irony, the bitter twist, is that he would one day follow the very same path, almost step for step. The image of Cookie loomed over him like a ghost in the wings of a theater. No matter how high Dick climbed, the specter of his father's habits lingered. Even when he was making America laugh, he knew deep down that the same demons his father had wrestled with were waiting for him too. It was like a curse passed down not through words or discipline, but through silence and example. This is where the story takes its first dramatic turn. Because when Dick finally looked in the mirror years later and saw his own reflection staring back at him, he didn't just see the beloved actor who made millions smile. He saw his father, Cookie, the man he had promised himself he would never become. That realization struck like a thunderbolt. It wasn't just about his own weakness anymore. It was about the cycle of damage repeating across generations. And in that moment, the fault line of his past became a ticking time bomb in his present. The perfect image of Dick Van Dyke, the eternal optimist, was balanced on top of a childhood wound that had never fully closed. And as success poured in and the spotlight grew hotter, that old wound was about to rip open in ways no one could have predicted. Because the stage that made him famous didn't just magnify his talent, it magnified his secrets, too. When the Dick Van Dyke Show exploded onto television screens in the early 1960s, it looked like pure magic. The chemistry between Dick and Mary Tyler Moore, Carl Reiner's sharp writing, and Dick's rubber-limbed comedy made the series a phenomenon. America saw a man who seemed effortlessly happy, able to turn any mishap into laughter. But behind the scenes, his world was slowly tilting out of balance. Fame is a gift, but it's also a pressure cooker. Overnight, Dick went from a struggling entertainer to a household name. Suddenly, the weight of expectation was crushing. Week after week, millions tuned in, waiting for him to be flawless. Producers and networks demanded perfection. Even Carl Reiner nearly walked away once after the network tried to censor an episode he believed in. For Dick, the easiest way to push down that tension was the same way his father had, through drinking. At first, it seemed harmless, just a way to unwind after rehearsals. But little by little, the habit deepened. He confessed years later that much of the 1960s and 1970s were lived in the grip of alcoholism. The shocking part is how well he hid it. On set, he never seemed impaired. He still nailed lines, charmed his co-stars, and landed pratfalls with perfect timing. But once the cameras stopped, the spiral tightened. The smile was real, but it was fueled by something he didn't want anyone to see. This is what made it so tragic. Dick's entire reputation rested on being the nice guy. His colleagues adored him, fans worshipped him, and the press never painted him as difficult. Yet inside, he was fighting a secret war. He admitted later the addiction wasn't glamorous or dramatic. It was quiet, insidious, and relentless. He'd wake up swearing to quit, only to fall back by night. And though few spoke of it, the strain bled into his relationships. The spiral wasn't only about alcohol. The fame machine itself added to it. Behind the applause, there were whispers of creative clashes and unspoken pressure. While Mary Tyler Moore's star was rising, rumors of strain on set grew louder. The show stayed polished for viewers, but for those living it, the cracks were obvious. This was the contradiction that defined Dick's life. Adored by millions for spreading joy, but privately tethered to something that could destroy everything he had built. He despised this secret identity, as if he were living as two different men at once. And as the ratings soared, he knew the double life couldn't last forever. Something had to give. And when it did, it wouldn't just threaten his career, it would shatter his marriage, his family, and the very image that made him untouchable. Because the spotlight wasn't the only place where cracks were starting to show. On screen, Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore looked like the perfect pair. Their chemistry was electric, so convincing that many swore they must have been in love off-screen. Every smile and playful exchange felt effortless. They were the dream couple of American television, funny, charming, and wholesome. But behind the scenes, the story wasn't quite as flawless. Mary was young, ambitious, and dazzlingly talented. She was only in her 20s when the show began, and her sudden rise to stardom came with its own pressures. The spotlight adored her, but it also scrutinized her. For Dick, working alongside someone whose star was climbing so quickly was both thrilling and challenging. Their friendship was genuine, but tested by long hours, creative disagreements, and the quiet weight of competition. Whispers hinted that not every day on set was joyful. Dick was wrestling with alcohol, while Mary fought her own battles, later admitting she too relied on drinking to cope. Two stars, side by side, carrying heavy secrets while playing America's most light-hearted couple. It's almost unthinkable. Later retrospectives suggested tensions sometimes flared, though both remained respectful. Mary confessed she felt immense pressure to live up to the image of Laura Petrie, while Dick admitted Mary was so talented she often outshined him. But admiration didn't erase exhaustion, and when cameras stopped rolling, the atmosphere wasn't always breezy. Carl Reiner fiercely protected the cast, yet even he couldn't block all the strain. When executives pushed or censors interfered, stress rippled through everyone. Combined with Dick's drinking and Mary's own struggles, the magic audiences adored came at a steep price. Here's the shocking truth: they never let it show. Performances stayed flawless, and even today, reruns hide the invisible weight they carried. That's Hollywood's paradox. What looks effortless can be the hardest work of all. As the seasons rolled on, the cracks only deepened. Dick's private life was straining under the spotlight, and Mary faced storms of her own. Their brilliant partnership masked a painful truth. Both were inching closer to breaking points no one could see. And for Dick, the fallout wasn't confined to the set. His private spiral was about to rip through his marriage, and when it did, the tabloids had a field day. For decades, Dick Van Dyke and his wife, Margie Willett, looked like the perfect Hollywood couple. They had married in 1948, long before fame, and raised 4 children together. But as Dick's career soared, the marriage began to fracture. His drinking created distance, and then came something even harder to hide: a long relationship with actress Michelle Triola. Michelle wasn't a passing fling. She remained central to his life for more than 30 years. To the public, it was scandalous. To his family, devastating. The tabloids feasted on the story, painting a shocking picture of America's favorite nice guy leading a double life. By 1984, after 36 years, Dick and Margie quietly divorced. She had been there before the fame and fortune, and now she was gone. For Dick, it was an emotional earthquake. He later admitted that the choices of that era haunted him, proof that even the most beloved star wasn't immune to betrayal or regret. The shocking part wasn't just the affair. It was how long he lived in that double life, balancing fatherhood with a painful secret. For most, it would have ended a career. For Dick, it became part of his hidden truth, a burden he carried into the next chapter of his life. And soon, that chapter would force him into a reckoning even more dangerous than a broken marriage, because the battle ahead was one that threatened his very survival. By the early 1970s, the facade was cracking wide open. The legendary smile, the effortless pratfalls, the endless charm, none of it could hide the truth forever. Dick Van Dyke had hit rock bottom. Alcohol, which once seemed like a harmless escape from the pressures of fame, had tightened its grip to the point where it threatened to swallow him whole. He later admitted that the habit wasn't glamorous, wasn't dramatic. It was slow, relentless, and humiliating. He would wake up swearing he would stop, only to find himself back in the same destructive cycle by nightfall. The breaking point came with a mirror moment, literally. One morning, staring at his reflection, he realized he no longer recognized the man looking back at him. He didn't see the beloved actor, the adored father, or the household name. He saw the ghost of his father, Cookie, the same man who had been absent, who had used the bottle as a shield. And that realization shook him to his core. He confessed later that the moment was like staring at a version of himself he couldn't allow to exist anymore. He knew he had to cut ties with that man forever. The man who reached for alcohol, the man who disappointed his family, the man who threatened to destroy everything he'd worked for. That vow to quit drinking wasn't just a private decision. It became the defining pivot of his life. In 1974, he starred in a made-for-television movie titled The Morning After. The role was hauntingly close to home. An alcoholic news anchor whose career and personal life crumble under the weight of addiction. For Dick, it wasn't just another part. It was an exorcism. He poured every ounce of his personal pain into the performance, and the authenticity was impossible to ignore. What happened next shocked him. Letters began flooding in from viewers across the country. Strangers, men and women who were quietly battling their own addictions, wrote to say that his performance gave them the courage to quit. They said they saw themselves in his character, that the rawness of his portrayal made them confront their own shadows. Dick realized that his personal hell had somehow become a lifeline for others. In exposing his vulnerability on screen, he had saved people he had never even met. It was a bittersweet victory. On one hand, he had found a way to turn his lowest moment into something meaningful. On the other, it was a constant reminder of just how close he had come to losing it all. From that point on, Dick lived with vigilance. He admitted later that he had to remain careful every single day, because the danger never fully disappeared. Sobriety wasn't a finish line, it was a daily decision, a constant refusal to speak to that darker self ever again. And yet, even as he rebuilt himself, there were parts of his life that remained tangled. The demons were quieter, but they weren't gone, and as he tried to heal, another test was waiting, this time tied not to his own reflection, but to his family name, because the next challenge came from someone who shared his blood. Dick Van Dyke's story wouldn't be complete without his younger brother, Jerry Van Dyke. To the world, Jerry was the funny, sometimes bumbling little brother who carved his own lane in comedy. But for decades, he lived in the long shadow of Dick's stardom. Every role Jerry took, whether on Coach or as a guest star, was inevitably compared to Dick's golden legacy. On the surface, the brothers kept things lighthearted, poking fun at each other's quirks and personalities. They even shared screen time in sitcom crossovers, laughing together in front of the cameras. But privately, the sibling dynamic was more complicated than anyone realized. Jerry was ambitious, restless, and desperate to step out from behind Dick's towering image. He made career choices that baffled critics, like turning down Gilligan's Island or starring in projects that fell flat. Meanwhile, Dick kept soaring, becoming the emblem of television's golden age. Friends close to the family whispered about Jerry's frustrations, about the quiet sting of being seen as the other Van Dyke. And though Dick never spoke cruelly of his brother, the distance between them sometimes felt larger than geography. What makes this chapter especially striking is how Dick handled it. Unlike his battles with alcohol, where he had to draw a clear, merciless line between himself and the bottle, he never cut Jerry out completely. But he did learn the importance of boundaries. He admitted later in life that he couldn't carry everyone's burdens, not his father's, not his brother's, not even his own past. To survive, he had to refuse to let those shadows consume him. And when Jerry passed away in 2018, Dick's response was tender, even mournful. He remembered his brother not as a rival, but as a friend, a companion in the unpredictable world of show business. It was a reminder that even through rivalry, even through strain, family ties could bend without breaking. But here's the hidden truth that rarely gets spoken. The real him Dick Van Dyke refused to speak to again was never Jerry, never a rival producer, never a co-star. It was the darker man within himself, the one who nearly destroyed his career, his marriage, and his health. In therapy, he made the vow that man was gone, exiled forever. He would never allow him back into the conversation. Late in life, Dick began speaking openly about it. He admitted the shame, the mistakes, and the relief of surviving long enough to look back. He wanted people to understand that even the happiest clown had ghosts, and that silencing them wasn't easy. But in drawing that permanent boundary, he didn't just save himself. He gave fans a rare gift, permission to face their own demons without shame. And so, the The shocking revelation is this: Dick Van Dyke, the man who brought laughter to millions, carried a hidden fracture his entire life. A brother's rivalry, a father's ghost, a marriage that broke, but above all, an inner self he buried for good. He refused to speak to that man ever again. And because of that vow, he lived long enough to turn his darkest battles into a legacy of hope.